let's dig into election results from 7 months ago. Right? So let me just make sure I got this working here. All right. Well, let's.
I'll advance it for you.
Yeah, we'll do that. Let's see. Yeah, because it's on the Zoom, so that's the tricky part of it.
Okay.
But let me just see if I can maybe pop that in, pop that out. It was working earlier, but that's okay. All right. Well, we'll figure it out. Okay. We're figuring this out. Okay. So we'll look at a couple things tonight, right? We'll set up with historical patterns. What do we expect to see in a midterm election? So it's kind of predictions, hypotheses about what we thought might happen. Then what were the results? Why did they end up that way? We're going to drill into some national themes, some state-based themes, and some local themes. And I drove my wife crazy last night by bringing up historical Emmett County election data and trying to get her take on it. And she was just like, I'm done with you. So, if this is what the summer's going to be for you, then, we got to find somewhere else to go. And then of course, what does this mean for 2024, right? This is like what we want to try to mine for inference and see with what we can set up for a few years. So go ahead, Mary. Yep. All right. So what does political science tell us, right? What it tells us is voter turnout in midterm elections is likely to be lower than presidential elections. This is like a historical truism, right? Presidential elections drive people to the polls. Midterm elections, people tend to stay home, right? Referendum theory is well developed in political science that midterm elections tend to be referendums on the president's party. What do we think about the job the president is doing? If we like it, we support their party. If we don't like them, we punish the party. The best indicators of where the public is on the current president is either public opinion polls of the president's job performance and or the economy, right? If they're going in the wrong direction, it will be bad for the president's party. And historically, presidential parties lose seats in Congress in the midterms. All of these things were pointing to a substantial Republican victory, right? The president's approval numbers were low. The economy had inflation burning through it, still does to some extent, that people were sour on. First time the voters could pass judgment on the Democrats in Congress and Biden. With lower voter turnout, this is probably going to be bad for the Democrats. So lots and lots of pundits kept talking about the red wave, right? The red wave is going to come and probably have Republicans take over the House and the Senate. This is kind of the inverse of the 2018 blue wave, right? Which was this Democratic victory in the midterms during Trump's administration. Go ahead, Mary. So this is what we should expect, right? Historically, voter turnout's much lower in midterms than in presidential elections. Although 2018 was a stark outlier, right? You see this huge jump between 2014, which was the previous midterm, and 2018. Still nowhere close to what presidential elections were, but historically, like really good, right? Maybe the best for like 100 years since 1914. So the big question was kind of like, well, what would 2022 look like? Would it look like 2018? Or would it look like 2014? Like, is 2018 a blip, or is it a harbinger of where we're going? And that was, people were trying to wrestle with this. Well, what does this mean? Go ahead, Mary. Also, the president's job approval, not good, right? This is a fairly complicated graph, and so you just kind of have to follow the various colors and whatever, but it has job approval ratings for every president since Reagan. Biden, not great, right? All presidents tend, and this will work at least, all presidents tend to start out high, 50+ range. They just gotten elected. There's a honeymoon period. People are happy we have the president that we have. And then every president, with the exception of George W. Bush, generally goes downhill, right? George W. Bush has this completely odd pattern because of 9/11, right? After 9/11, his approval rating skyrockets. And then, of course, he diminishes over time. So this is not, well, actually, wait a minute. Hang on. I think this one is George. This is George H.W. Bush, his dad, I think. Maybe not. Oh, this is George H.W. Bush here. Yeah. This is only year 1 and year 2. So, yeah. And George H.W. Bush's is a little high because of the Gulf War, right? So what's that, kind of near the end of his second year or so, he gets really high approval ratings. So Biden started out in general, kind of where everybody else's tends to start out, and then went down, kind of generally where everybody else's tended to end up. So job approval rating, not so hot. You would expect this to be pretty bad for the president's party. Mary, go ahead. Yeah. Again, president's parties tend to lose seats in the midterms, right? There's a few exceptions, of course, right? So this shows mostly House. This is all House seats, because the Senate, there's only 100 senators, only 33 are up at any one time. So losing one or two, it's hard to like get a good indicator. House seats, though, there's so many of them that you can see big swings in these midterm elections. All presidents lose seats, Democrats, Republicans, right? There's a couple outliers here. This is the George W. Bush 2002 midterm, where he did pretty well after 9/11. This is the Bill Clinton 98 midterm, which was kind of payback for Republicans for impeachment for the president. But you can see the trend. I mean, the trend is just presidents lose seats. So like you're expected to lose seats, right? How much you lose seats, well, that kind of depends. Do you stanch the bleeding, or do you suffer these terrible, this is the Obama 2010 debacle where they lose, 60 seats in the House or so. So you're expecting the Republicans to gain seats, the Democrats to lose them. The question was by how much? Given the president's approval rating and inflation going through the economy, people were starting to look at something like this as kind of a sign, or some kind of big Democratic loss somewhere in the 30-40 seat range, and that was supposed to be kind of where it was going to end up. Go ahead, Mary. Well, how did we do? Okay. About 47% of the voting eligible population turned out in 2022. Okay, so it's lower than 2018, right? Do you want to hit the next one too? Yep. In 2018, it was about 50%. So we were lower, right? That's to be expected. 2018 was this huge turnout election, like impressive turnout numbers for a midterm. So down 3.5%, that's not bad. I mean, lots of times turnout in midterm elections is in the high 30s. So like 47, we're still okay, right? We're down, but like it's not too bad. Right? Anybody want to guess states that had the highest voter turnout in 2022? Wisconsin, Michigan, California, Pennsylvania. All right, go ahead, hit a couple, Mary. Let's see. You were right in the north. Everybody who guessed northern states, well done, right? Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, okay. Whenever you talk about voting, Minnesota is the safest bet. You go to Vegas and you want to place bets on like voter turnout rates, just bet the Scandinavians. I mean, they just turn out to vote nonstop. Maine, that's an interesting one. Oregon, okay, right? Anybody want to guess lowest voter turnout in 2022? Mississippi. Oh, and that, again, pretty good bet, right? Yeah, Mississippi. We're all eager to have the teacher's pet. Guess all the teacher's pet states, right? All right, what do we got, Mary? Yeah, lowest states. Go ahead. All right, Tennessee. Ooh, 30%. Woo, dragging down the average here, Tennessee. Yeah, this is from Michael McDonald, not the singer, but the professor at University of Florida. Yeah, Michael McDonald has gone into voter analysis now. But Michael McDonald, bless his heart, is a professor at University of Florida, and these are the types of things he obsesses over. So imagine the conversations he has with his wife. Yeah, he is really interesting stuff. Yeah, Minnesota is always really high. Unfortunately, Mississippi, Tennessee, fairly low all the time. Okay, right? So here's what the Senate turned out to be, right? All the states in gray or like non-colored, they don't have elections, right? There's 100 senators, a third of them are up every 2 years. So like we had in Michigan, we didn't have a senator running for re-election or election this cycle. We will have one in 2024 and in 2026, and then not 2028. So we're in the off cycle in this round. But plenty of states had elections. The colors are based on the winners. Going in, it was a 50-50 Senate, 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans. And here I'm kind of glazing over some differences because the nitpickers will say, of course, that this little green bar is 2 independents, now 3 independents. And of course, they're right. One of the independents is Bernie Sanders over here in Vermont. He's so independent that he ran for the Democratic nomination for president, so we can put a little asterisk by him. And then Angus King, who was a senator in Maine, and now Kirsten Sinema, who is a senator from Arizona. However, all 3 of them caucus with the Democrats. So, we'll call it 51-49. The Democrats managed to increase their majority from 50 to 51. And they did that by flipping this seat in Pennsylvania. A Republican retired, Pat Toomey, and the Democrat John Fetterman won, turning that state from red to blue. And giving the Democrats a 51-seat majority. The Democrats held onto most of the other seats they had to defend, including a seat in Georgia, a tough win they had to pull out in Colorado. Michael Bennet won. Another one they had to pull out in Arizona. So they had to win a couple tight elections, but at the end of the day, they pull out a 51-seat majority, which again, goes against the narrative of the red wave, right? And we'll look into how this happened a little bit. Okay, next map, right? We'll look at the House. Boy, you can really count votes in the House. About 108 million ballots cast in 2022. If you tally up all the votes for every House member in the country, and you kind of organize them by party, you'll see that in the national popular vote for the House, the Republicans have a bit of a majority, 50.6, and you can see down here the translation of the percent of the vote they got and the percent of the seats they earned in the House. Pretty close, pretty accurate. I mean, there's no big blowouts here. There's no huge gap where someone gets 50% of the vote and they get 54% of the seats, right? So the votes are fairly equally distributed. This graph over here shows kind of historical Democratic vote shares. So what percentage of the vote they got. So you can see here, this is about your 48% or so. And then the percent of the seats that they earn, just short of a majority, about 49% or so. So this is like the 2022 results, but you can see historically kind of when Democrats got a majority of the vote, they got a majority of the seats. This is kind of that weird outlier election where like they earn about 51% of the vote, but they don't get a majority of the seats. These are the types of elections you want to try to guard against, but like these all seem to make sense. And so does 2022. So again, it's a fairly close national vote. The House is fairly narrow. The Republicans get 222 seats. That's a 4-seat majority in the House. Halfway is 218. And the Democrats get 213. So again, it's not a huge majority for the Republicans. People were expecting 25, 30 seats that the Democrats would lose. And instead, the Democrats gave up about 9 or 11 seats, depending on how you would want to count various members of the House. And Republicans seize the majority, but by a fairly narrow margin. They don't have this big blowout red wave that kind of everybody was expecting, right? I always have students look at this map. This is the map of congressional districts in the country. And what you can see here is the intensity of margins of victory. So in other words, dark red areas, Republicans win by a lot. Dark blue areas, Democrats win by a lot. But those kind of intermediate shades of either pink or whatever this is, yellow or light blue, shows that it's not as easy red-blue as maybe a lot of the political maps we look at tell us. Not every Democrat wins by a huge blowout. Not every Republican wins by a huge blowout. Instead, you have some blowouts and some fairly close elections. It's a little bit tough to see the urban areas, right? I mean, there's like 12 districts in here, but you get a sense. I always have students try to pick out what they see in this map. Right, they normally identify, urban areas. Whatever that is, Memphis. Yeah, sure. Okay. Yep. And kind of the famous Republican L here from like the upper plains down through here, through the South. And I always say, well, what explains this? Not an urban area, not an urban area. not an urban area, not an urban area, not urban areas, right? And these are districts drawn in relationship to the Voting Rights Act, right? So the Voting Rights Act mandates that states that have significant minority populations cannot draw districts in a way to dilute the voting power of those minorities. So in other words, if you have 20% of your state is African American and you have 5 congressional districts, you can't draw 5 districts that are designed to elect white people, right? One of them's got to have some kind of edge that has African American majorities. So that's why Mississippi draws this district and Alabama this one, Georgia down here, right? And of course, over here, Native American populations, Hispanic populations, right? Although it does give you some shape of the interesting shapes of congressional districts, like that one is very strange, right? These are very strange, right? You know, and so on and so forth. But it's always interesting to look. I would have this on a shower curtain if I could, and just like look at it in the bathroom and never leave, you know, for the whole summer. Yes, ma'am. Yep. Over here. Sure. So the question is about Iowa over here. So Iowa has 4 congressional districts. This one heavily Republican, a little Alexa Republican, but like by a smaller margin, maybe 5 to 7 points, 5 to 7 points, 2 to 4 points, right? Like victory margins, right? So this is like Lauren Boebert, who won by like, I don't know, 85 votes or something in Southwest Colorado. You know, so yeah, I don't know. I could look at this endlessly, but again, this is like the political geography of America, right? As you break it down, urban areas and coasts, right? So coasts and coasts, urban areas here, and lots of other districts that are far more rural. The best victory of the whole thing might have been Alaska, a state that hasn't voted Republican in, I don't know, when was Alaska a state? 1950? Like, I mean, 1960, it was never voted for a Republican, but they have a wild electoral system for their house. They have 1 House seat, and a Democrat managed to get in because a Republican split the votes. So there were 4 candidates on the final ballot, and 2 of them were Republicans, and 1 was Sarah Palin. And they split the vote. There was an independent, and the Democrat managed to win. So it was a wild election. So we'll see if she wins the re-election in 2 years. Probably not. Right. In any case, Republicans don't have as big a victory as maybe we imagined. Right. Well, that's where it's going to end, folks. No. Right, exactly. Man, tomorrow if I had the chance on that one. Right. I think so, especially for the House seat in a long time. Yeah, heavily Republican. Sometimes they've elected Democratic senators. There we go. Fabulous. People say, well, what explains the Republican edge, right? A lot of people look at it and they say, well, gerrymandering, right, where you draw these district lines to try to elect members of your own party. But who controls redistricting is spread out across the country, right? Most House seats, so if you're looking at doing the quick math, 173 of the 435, so we're looking there somewhere around 35% or so, are in states where Republicans control redistricting. About 110 or so, including Michigan, are in states where an independent group controls redistricting. About 40 or so are in states where Democrats control redistricting, and about 100 or so are in states where the courts are involved in some way, shape, or manner. So who draws these districts for the House is split across the entire country. At the end of the day, the Republicans didn't do as well in their races that they needed to, right? So in 2020, we counted heads, right? We did the census. When you count heads in the census, you figure out where everybody lives. If states have not gained much in terms of population, then they lose seats in the House of Representatives. Like Michigan, we lost 1 seat. We grew 2% over 10 years, which is a-okay, but not good enough, right? So we lost a seat because our population didn't grow as fast as like Texas and Florida, and strangely enough, Idaho, and a couple other states that really gained in population really, really quickly. So then you have to redraw all the lines in your state, all your congressional district boundaries, to see where representatives are going to be representing. And so in a lot of states, Republicans oversaw the whole process. In a number of states, including Michigan, an independent group like our redistricting commission oversaw the process. In a few states, Democrats controlled the entire process, and in some states, the courts controlled the process. The Republican Party benefited from a number of these redistricting efforts, but probably not as much as they needed to, right? They probably needed to really crush it here. And instead, they didn't quite get as many seats as they were hoping. I mean, if you control redistricting in 20 different states that controls almost 40% of the House of Representatives, I think you want to do better than gaining 5 seats. I think you want to see increase an even larger net of seats there. So not shockingly, the Democrats did well here. Republicans did pretty well here, which is kind of interesting. These independent groups are supposed to be kind of nonpartisan, but when you net it all out, the Republicans did better than the Democrats did in those states. And the courts, New York is an interesting case. We'll have to look at that one at some point in the future. The courts had to redraw some of New York's boundaries. New York, a very Democratic state, and Republicans benefited from some of that redrawing. They won some seats they probably weren't expecting to, frankly. So it wasn't quite gerrymandering. They didn't quite do, that wasn't quite it. And I dig a little deeper. All right, well, who voted? Right, voter turnout was about 48% or so, which is pretty good for a midterm. Who voted? So this is a little complicated here, but this goes by generation. And it looks at, in the 2018 column, it tells you how much, what size of the voters were of that generation. So in other words, in 2018, 14% of the voters were from the silent or greatest generation. 38% of the voters were baby boomers, 25% were Gen Xers, and 23% were Gen Zs or millennials. And then it tells you 2022. So over 4 years, how did the composition of the electorate change? And what you saw is the young people still turned out, right? 2018, Democratic victories in 2018 were largely, though not entirely, based on strong youth turnout, right? Millennials being everyone born after 1980, Gen Z after 1996 or so. So Gen Z is just getting into voting, that generation. So you can see the young people still turned out, and the silent and greatest generation, they diminished as a size of the part of the electorate. There's very well regarded political science research that shows basically after the age of 75, voter participation tends to wane because nature takes its toll, right? Mortality, infirmity, hurdles to voting, all the rest of it. Your peak voting age, kind of ends at 75. So as those generations near that age, we should expect to see this number continue to go down. The baby boomers are the largest cohort of Americans. So it's not a shock that they are like a really strong, big part of the voter age turnout. But the second largest cohort of Americans is the millennials, right? So it's intriguing to see this number continue to go up. Then this column tells you their level of Democratic support. So in the 2020 election versus 2022, so what you can see is that the Democratic strength in this generation's turnout increased over the last 2 years, whereas it fell in every other age demo, right? So now you see why in these debt limit talks that are going on right now feverishly in Washington, Republicans are saying you got to kill this student loan, cancellation or student loan forgiveness, and you see why Biden and the Democrats are sticking to their guns. Because this generation says, yeah, that's really important to us. They can read these numbers. Well, that's one of the last things they're going to want to give up, right? Because this is part of the coalition that is Democratic strength, right? So why no red wave? That's kind of hard to read, but I'm going to break it down. All right, so exit polls, I don't know, you got to take exit polls with a grain of salt, right? Exit polls are in part grabbing people as they walk out of the voting, the ballot, the polling place, and saying, "Gee, do you want to tell me a little bit about who you voted for and why you voted for them?" So yeah, taking with some grain of salt, but this is a very intriguing stat. So they look over here. This is what they ask voters. Well, what do you think about Biden as president? Do you strongly approve, somewhat disapprove, strongly disapprove? And then they say, who did you vote for? Like for office? Well, not shockingly, people who strongly approved of Biden voted mostly for Democrats. And not shockingly, people who strongly disapproved of Biden voted for Republicans. This is the interesting number. 10% of the electorate said, I somewhat disapprove of Biden, but look at how the Democrats managed to hang on to that support. That's critical, right? That's a reason why there's no huge red wave. Normally in wave elections, this group goes with the out party. And look, it's close, but man, you can fight that one to a draw. You're going to do okay among people who somewhat disapprove of you. You're going to do okay. Again, this is not shocking. You would expect these people to probably vote for Democrats. This is the surprising number. Democrats held their own with people who said, you know, Biden, I don't know. They still, about half of those people still voted for Democrats. That's a huge number, right? All right, so this is from the Washington Post and from a bunch of other people over here. This talks about wasted votes. You run for office, and if there's 100 voters, you need to win 51 of those voters. That's all you need. You're just running against one other person, let's just say. Is it any more beneficial to you to win 80 of the voters, or 95 of the voters, or 99 of the voters? No, you just need 51, right? 51, 52, you win 90, you feel good about yourself. But essentially, you could lose 39 of those voters and still win. What you can calculate is wasted votes. How many votes did you get that you didn't really need? And this plays into gerrymandering, and it plays into polarization, right? And what you found when you started to count all of these votes is basically Republicans in 2022 ran up huge margins in their races. Good. You won 80 to 20, 95 to 5. Okay, fantastic. Guess what? You don't need to win by that much, right? If you want to win a lot, you have to efficiently distribute your votes. It's a lot better if all of your candidates win 55-45, because you're going to win more elections than if you have one guy who wins 90 to 10 and the other party wins 55 to 45 and a bunch of other seats. Guess what? All those wins are the same, right? So what's happened in the country is that red states have gotten redder and blue states have gotten bluer, but red states have gotten more red than blue states have gotten blue, right? Which means Republicans win in these elections by huge margins, and that's great. Doesn't translate into more seats, right? Whereas historically, it had always been the Democrats' problem. Democrats in those urban districts, those urban in Detroit and Chicago and Indianapolis, they win by these huge margins because they were all drawn into this nice little tight city district. And you don't need to do that. What's the point of winning by 50 points? Feels good, but So what happens is that Republicans have been wasting votes, right? And some of this happens after the census and after you redraw all those districts. Democrats and Republicans both tried to draw districts that would advantage their parties in the states they controlled. And what happens is the Republicans, they just got too many voters in the wrong places, right? You inefficiently distribute your votes. That's not a good thing, right? If you want to win, like, let's say, a House of Representatives race, that's the whole country. It's not going to help you all that much, right? So this is an interesting turn in this process. It had always been a Democratic problem, and now it seems to be a Republican one, right? Okay, flip to that, right? So why no red wave? All right, so in Michigan, how did we do, right? Go ahead, Mary. Yep. All right, so in 2018, we passed a constitutional amendment creating an independent citizens redistricting commission, right? We're going to have the census in 2020. We had to redraw all these House districts. Prior to 2018, every 10 years, the state legislature would draw all these districts. Doesn't go all that well when you trust these people, right? Like they have political interests, they have partisan interests, they want to draw these things to advantage their party and disadvantage the other party. What we chose to do in 2018 was we would create a panel of citizens, 13 people. Hang on. Yes, I forgot the exact numbers now. 13 or 15, some odd number. And they'd be divided between self-identified Republicans, self-identified Democrats, and self-identified independents or third-party supporters. They would draw the maps, and you would have to get it approved by at least 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and 2 independents on the commission. So it had to be a kind of cross-party agreement, right? And the idea was to try to avoid this. So this was 2016 in Michigan in the congressional election. If you tallied up all the votes statewide, Republican candidates got 50.5% of the vote, but they got 9 of the 14 seats. Democrats got 49.4% of the vote, and the Democrats got 5 of the 14 seats, right? it's a 50-50 election, but you had this massive disparity in who wins. And that's because the Republicans drew this map in 2010 at the last census. They packed Democrats in urban areas into a bunch of seats where they would win like 85 to 15, and Republicans would win the other seats 55 to 45. So the Republicans efficiently distributed their votes. They packed Democrats into these urban districts around Chicago. Chicago. I'm from Illinois originally. Just default to Chicago is like political corruption. Detroit, Ann Arbor, Flint, and Republicans would win the rest. You can have these measures here. The efficiency gap basically tells you how many wasted votes there are. 14.6% towards the GOP is indicates there was huge wasted votes on the side of the Democrats. And the mean median difference basically says what was the difference between the median or the center congressional seat in the election results. So like not the one the Republicans blew out their opponent or the Democrats blew out their opponent, but what was the closest congressional result? And what's the difference between that result and this statewide vote? And the closest result was about 8-point GOP win versus a 50-50 statewide split. So we wanted to try to avoid that and make fairer districts. And the commission drew their maps in 2021, and this was the result in 2022. We lost a seat in Congress, so we went from 14 to 13. We had about the same result, basically 50-50 split, but the seats split basically 50-50, with Democrats taking one more. And if you look at those measures, they were far reduced. There's almost no wasted voting in the state. And the mean median differential between this and the Dems, I mean, it was basically almost nothing, right? So the median seat won was Democrat won it with like 53% of the vote. So it's much, much better in Michigan. We did a nice job with redistricting in this cycle. Now, of course, those maps were based in 2021. This is the next election. Let's see how they do in 2028, because we won't do it again until after the 2030 census. So those maps may age poorly, but for right now, we did pretty well. It was about a 50-50 vote. It was about a 50-50 split in the seats. Can't get a lot better than that, right? So, yeah, Citizens Research Council and I did all the other ones. Yeah, where did Democrats and Republicans win? I mean, look, where you can see here is Republican dominance over here in rural suburban mix or sparse suburban, right? Democrats doing really well in the urban areas, but they held their own in the suburbs. About 60% of the voters in America live in suburbs, right? So most of the congressional seats exist in these areas, and Democrats managed to hold their own in the suburbs. You can see in 2018 how well they did. Their majorities, were huge over here. In 2020, a little bit less, but they held off the Republicans in the suburbs, which is the key. You can see in 2018 this huge Democratic wave. They did a little better in like pure rural areas than they did in 2020. But you can see this strength here in these sparse suburban areas. Boy, those are areas you just can't lose if you want to hold your majority in the House. And so Democrats fought them to a draw pretty well there. So there's another reason why there wasn't a huge red wave. Was just plus. Look, voters vote the same. I mean, the voters are creatures of habit, right? Like people tend to pull red or pull blue. There's polarization in the country. And so these waves are becoming fewer and fewer and smaller because there's just fewer undecided or swing voters in the country. More and more people kind of are more habituated in their political habits, and it's harder and harder to kind of reach across and build that huge wave that you might be able to build, right? Trump was a fairly polarizing figure in the election. He backed up a bunch of candidates. Some candidates did well, other candidates did poorly. There's a lot of conflicting research about what his influence may or may not have been, but for a guy who wasn't on the ballot at all in 2022, he had a huge effect. And so some of his endorsed candidates did win. Many of them didn't, especially in the highest profile races. And so Democrats did a nice job of kind of making him the face of the Republican Party, even though he wasn't on the ballot. But it kept him front and center as voters have very polarized attitudes about President Trump, even 4 years, even 2 years after his term ended. So there was another kind of figure there. How did we do in Michigan? Plenty of people turned out, right? It's been going up. Here's 2018. Again, we had a huge bump. 2022, not doing too badly. As voter turnout goes, we were kind of in the high 50s, which is pretty good. Not nearly what Minnesota manages to do, but pretty good as well. So we turn out quite a bit in Michigan. Go ahead, Mary. Yeah. At the state level, Whitmer wins, and I won't go into all the races, but like Whitmer wins. Here's the map of Michigan, at least by county. And again, you see some of this intensity, right? So like pinkish areas are fairly close results, dark blue, or dark red, fairly big victories for either Tudor Dixon or Gretchen Whitmer. Lighter blue areas, say here, lighter areas, less strong wins for Gretchen Whitmer. Whitmer replicated a lot of her map from 2018 when she first ran for governor. Any Democrat has to basically win this little ladder from the Saginaw area down to Wayne County, connecting Genesee and Oakland counties. I mean, you've got to win this kind of ladder here to have any kind of chance. What's impressive about Whitmer, what she did in 2018 and then did again in 2022, was win Kent County in Grand Rapids. She managed to win Macomb County, which she didn't win 4 years ago. And if you hit the next thing, right, we can see she managed to flip Grand Traverse County up here in Traverse City, right? So this again tells you like where people did better and where they did worse. So Tudor Dixon did worse than Bill Schuette 4 years ago in a lot of northwestern Michigan, in the Lower Peninsula. Right, whereas Whitmer continued to build on her strengths, did better in Oakland County than she did 4 years ago, did better in Macomb County, better in Kent County, better in the Saginaw area. Critically, she won these counties that I think Trump managed to win in 2016, and Biden couldn't carry. I think the Shiawassee County, he couldn't manage to carry that one. What's that again? Saginaw County, yeah, he couldn't. So he couldn't carry some of these, but Whitmer could. So again, like where they did better, where they did worse, you see Whitmer build on her strength in Southeast Michigan here, and you see Dixon unable to replicate Republican margins in a lot of northwestern Michigan, the Lower Peninsula here. I mean, all the way from Sheboygan down through Grand Traverse and Benzie County. So this is our region is interesting. And I'll get into more of this in a little bit. Maybe there's something going on here. I don't know, but you can see where some of these patterns go, right? As we look at these maps. Yeah. All right. Yeah. If you start looking at the numbers, right, Republican turnout fell in every county in Michigan when compared to 2020. Now, that's not a shock, right? Because like we would expect that. Presidential elections are up here, midterms are down here. We would expect turnout levels to fall in most places. But the fact that Republican turnout fell in every county is quite stunning. And then when you look at Democratic turnout, go ahead, Mary. When you look at Democratic turnout, it actually rose in 7 counties, including some in northern Michigan, northwestern Michigan, Otsego and Roscommon County, right? Presque Isle. Doesn't mean that like Whitmer carried these places, but it means that more Democrats turned out to vote in 2022 than did in 2020, which frankly is astounding because I thought 2020 was going to be the highest turnout election of my life. But the fact that more of them turned out in those 7 counties in a midterm election is quite stunning. And again, goes a little bit of a way to talk about why Whitmer won. It's not just about the counties you managed to turn blue. It's about the margins you managed to lose by. If you lose Oscoda County and Otsego County 65-35, that's not great. But if you lose at 55-45, that's better, right? The Democratic playbook to win in Michigan is to keep Republican margins low in northern Michigan and blow them out in southeast Michigan. But if you lose by huge margins in northern Michigan, it's hard to make all of that up by driving out turnout in Oakland County and Wayne County. I mean, Wayne County's bleeding population. There's just fewer voters there than ever, which means Democratic turnout, if you're looking to win, if you're Whitmer or somebody else in the future, you need to lose by less in those other areas that you're going to lose in anyway, right? And then when you look at it, based on what Trump and Biden got in Michigan in 2020, right? Whitmer got 86 out of every 100 Biden voters to turn out and vote for her. And Dixon got 73 of every 100 Trump voters to turn out. Right? At the end of the day, that's how you lose. That's how you win and how you lose, right? So again, these are different elections, right? Presidential elections, more people turn out. You expect these numbers to be smaller. You expect turnout to fall. But it's about, well, how much of your base can you get out? And the Democrats had a strong turnout advantage, especially in Michigan, right? Go ahead, Mary. Yeah. We had 3 proposals on the ballot, right? The term limits proposal that changed term limits in the state constitution from a strict, what was it? 6 years in the House, right? 3 terms, and 8 years in the Senate, 2 terms. That you could serve in a lifetime. So the most you could do would be 14. And we voted to change that in this proposal 1 to, I think, 16 years total, I think it was. And you could split it up however you want it. Most of Michigan voted for this. Only the counties in the dark voted against it. So this carried pretty impressively across the state. Prop 2 was about voting, promote the vote, number 2. This passed 60-40 as well. Dark counties voted against it. Lighter counties voted for it. Again, pretty much a no-brainer passage, 60-40, right? It wasn't really in doubt. You start to see a little bit more opposition here in northern Michigan and in the Thumb region, right? But by and large, most of the state goes for it. And then, of course, Prop 3, the Reproductive Freedom for All Amendment. This is the closest of the 3, right? It passes, roughly 58-43 or so. Interestingly, 7 counties that voted for Dixon, the Republican candidate for governor, voted yes on Prop 3, which was like the pro-choice position, including Emmett County, right? Emmett County went narrowly for Tudor Dixon, but went heavier in favor of Prop 3. And again, it received about 50,000 more votes for yes than even Gretchen Whitmer got. So this was one of the highest tallying proposals on the ballot. It got more yes votes than even for Gretchen Whitmer. And here again, this map looks a lot actually like the gubernatorial map, right? With a couple exceptions, right? Voting yes here in the bridge from kind of Detroit to Saginaw, the kind of Grand Traverse region over here, Kent County, right? Ingham and Kalamazoo, these, but again, some differences. Emmett County being one of them, a couple counties in the UP. So, interesting, just kind of a little more nuance to this question as it went through the ballot, right? All right, so now we'll get really local. All right, go ahead, hit it again. How'd we do turning out? All right, so here's presidential elections. We really vote in this county. Good for us, right? 73% of Emmett County voters turned out in 2020. That's amazing. The middle of a pandemic, right? A lot, almost 3 of 4 voters turned out in 2020. But the midterm elections, boy, 2014, boy, that looks like we're in the past. I think we're in the era of high turnout, which is both good and bad. But I mean, you didn't see much of a dip from 2018 to 2022 in Emmett County, only about a point down off of one of the highest turnout midterm elections ever, about 10 points down from 2020. Again, not a stunner. This is how presidential midterm elections go. It's always low. What you really need to do is compare that to that to that, right? This is apples to apples. So again, big turnout in 2022 in Emmett County, 6 out of every 10 voters vote, right? If you look historically over the last 10 years, and you look at votes in Emmett County for the most prominent office on the ballot. So here we're talking 2012, this will be the presidential race. 2014, this will be the gubernatorial race, right? And you just look at these headlines in Emmett County, right? 10 years ago, Mitt Romney gets, has an 18-point lead on Barack Obama in Emmett County. I've forgotten now who ran for governor in 2014, frankly. Rick Snyder wins against no-name Democrat. Don't know who he is. So a 27-point Republican advantage. But as we go forward, right, as we bring it more to the present, you start to see that Republican edge start to narrow. Go ahead, Mary. All right, now you get down to 2020, and now you get down to 2022. Over the course of 10 years, there's been a 16-point swing, right, in favor of the Democratic candidate. Now, it's not a straight swing. I mean, here it goes up, then down, then steady, then down. 2024 might be a totally different story. But there seems to be a trend line here, right? Now, as I started to get more and more interested into it, I started to look at a map of our county, and I started to think, well, this is the county as a whole, but man, we all know that the county is fairly varied, right? There's a big difference between Bear Creek and Little Traverse and McKinley and Cross Village and Carp Lake, right? Like these are different types of areas. What do we observe differences within the county or not, right? Go ahead, Mary. Oh yeah, we'll look at this. Go ahead, one more. Yeah, so Whitmer in 2022 gets 96% of every Emmett County Biden voter. So basically everybody who voted for Biden turned out and voted for Whitmer. But only 80% of people who voted for Trump in 2020 turned out to vote for Tudor Dixon, right? So when you actually run the math, it seems like there might be 2,500 people in Emmett County who might only turn out to vote for Trump, but not vote for other Republicans, right? I mean, somehow this 20% of people, are there 2,500 only Trump voters? I don't know, maybe there are, but this is, when you look at the numbers, this might be a thing. All right, so let's look at two townships, Little Traverse and McKinley. I live in Little Traverse, so that's why I wanted to look at it. All right, so 10 years ago, they looked really similar, right? Obama-Romney, or Romney-Obama, Snyder, somebody, right? Double-digit margins in both for Republicans. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, keep hitting it, Mary. Yeah. Look at how they change. Oh, back one. Back. Oh, now we've done it. There we go. Keep back and stop. Okay. Hit it, stop. Good, perfect. But look at this. The people on Zoom, they'll love that. But look at McKinley. Steady. Look at Little Traverse. We talk about polarization in the country. We look at like red states and blue states and red counties and blue counties. And we have to look inside the counties, right? Polarization isn't something that's happening over there. It's happening in the county, right? Go ahead, Mary. Let's do it again. West Traverse here and Maple River over here. All right, so 10 years ago, about the same. Look at that number. Oof. It's like it's like Rick Snyder lived in West Traverse Township. All right, go ahead. And one more. Stop. Look at Maple River. Steady as she goes. Look at West Traverse. All right, go ahead. Look, Petoskey and Harbor Springs. Again, it's like Rick Snyder has a home up here somewhere. All right, right? Harbor Springs and Petoskey. Okay, this is a weird result in Petoskey given the time, but okay, go ahead. Yeah. Harbor Springs votes for Biden. Well, how'd that not make the headline of of that newspaper, right? It goes to Whitmer by 8. What do we see here? Is this the story of movement into the county from people from other either parts of the state or parts of the country? I mean, the 2020 census revealed that Emmett County was one of the only counties in northern Michigan to grow in population, but that the average age of the county went up. right? So is it an influx of people who are bringing their politics and views into Emmett County? And this is why we're seeing the shift. And maybe they're moving into these areas and not these areas. Maybe that's one theory. The other theory is that American politics is being driven overwhelmingly now by education levels, and wealth and education. And that voters are increasingly split on these questions. That if you have a college degree or don't have a college degree, if you make X amount of dollars or below X amount of dollars, I might be able to predict who you'd be likely to vote for, right? Is there a difference in education and income levels here versus here? And that's another theory. Or is it just candidates? Candidates make races, you know, and some people like this candidate and they don't like this candidate, and that's how it goes. Maybe, I don't know. These are theories. These are things to look at. I don't have that data because I don't have gender data for the townships. I wish I did. If someone would like to volunteer to go house to house in Maple River, I'd love it, but I don't have the data on that to tell, unfortunately. I could only do that at the state level as I have that data, but I don't, county level, man, I wish I had it, right? Go ahead, Mary. Well, so then I got even more curious, and this is where my wife eventually turned on the television and stopped listening to me. I thought, boy, does this hold up? Like, what if we look at lower level races? Here I'm looking at presidents and governors, right? Like, these are races people tend to know about. But we all vote the down ballot races. I mean, have many of you ever held that marker in the ballot booth and really scratched your head about who I should be voting for Wayne State Board of Governors? Really noodled that one over, right? And thank God at least they give us political party affiliation to like make it easier. In Illinois, we used to vote for University of Illinois Board of Trustees, and they didn't give us political party affiliation. And they had 20 candidates and it said vote for 7. And you were like, who are these people? So so like a good son, I went to my mother and I said, how do you decide who to vote for? And she was like, Scott, I vote for the people with the longest last names. And I said, there's a lot of Polish people on that board due to me. A lot of Repczynskis and Skaronskis, and you know, not too many Smiths. You know, sorry, I just, you know. But I wanted to know, like, okay, well, what if we looked at local races? Like we see this pattern, right, of like outer townships staying heavily Republican, inner townships around the Bay moving more in a Democratic direction. But what if we looked at Congress, state senator, state representative, county commissioner races? Like, do we see a similar pattern, right? Do we see the same divergent pattern, or are people voting on like races they know, president, governors, and down ballot, they're just like, Republican, Republican, Republican. Like, I don't know, what do we find, right? So let's look. So this is 2022. So statewide offices are governor, attorney general, secretary of state. Locals are Congress, state senator, state rep, and county commissioner. So what we see is this is the average Republican percentage of the vote, is that in local races, in all these townships, there's a GOP has an advantage, or not an advantage, they have greater levels of support for local races than they do for statewide ones. Somewhere in the 5 to 7% margin, right? About a 6% margin here. These are the two townships we might expect to have less Republican support, as they seem to be moving closer to Democrats. These are the two we expect to have higher levels of Republican support. But while the support levels are different, the margins are not that different, right? 7 points, 7 points, 7 points, 6 points, okay, right? So not too much of a difference. Even within the cities, more people tend to vote for Republicans in larger numbers for local races than statewide ones. And Petoskey, a more Democratic area, is going to have less support. But like even then, Republicans running for local office enjoy higher levels of support than those running statewide. Okay, and I tested all these differences. It's not just random noise. There are statistical differences between the two. So it seems like this actually holds up. And then I thought, because at this point my wife went to bed, I was like, well, I did all this work historically. So like, what were the margins, say, in 2014? Because that's what we have to compare it to, right? The oldest midterm that the Emmett County Clerk's website still has results for, because as huge of a nerd I am not going to dig through the paper records. If it's online, I'm going to look at it. So like, what were the margins in 2014? Has there been movement since 2014 to 2022? Like, I don't know about that. So of course I did that for you people. All right, here's Little Traverse, right? Statewide GOP average in 2014 for governor, attorney general, secretary of state, 65% of Little Traverse Township on average voted Republican. Now 50%, a 15-point drop in 8 years. Locally, 8 years ago, Republican candidates for local offices, state senator, state rep, county commissioner, members of Congress, got about 62% of Little Traverse voters, now 56%. Again, this is the township we might expect to see these drops. Maple River, a little bit of a weakening here for statewide candidates, but an increase for local GOP candidates. Again, conforming to what we might think, that Republican strength stays steady here, maybe it's moving here, okay? West Traverse, a 20% drop in 8 years for statewide GOP candidates, and a 9% drop for local GOP candidates in West Traverse. Still doing well. I mean, John DeMoose and Neil Frisky and Jack Bergman are still getting 60% of the vote in West Traverse Township, but they were getting 70% 8 years ago. Whereas McKinley, steady as she goes, right? Again, this conforms to our expectations that these townships are moving slowly and they're not turning blue, but they're getting decidedly more pink than they are dark red, right? And then if you look at Harbor Springs, because Petoskey was so complicated, there's so many wards and all the rest of it, right? You see similar things. Statewide GOP candidates received 61% of Harbor Springs voters in 2014, 51% in 2022, 58% local GOP in 2014. Oh, I have these backwards. I'm sorry. This should be 66. This should be 58. Yeah, I screwed that up. It was late. What can I say? Yeah, so what we see is some movement here, right? And movement that conforms to what we have been seeing in the county, right? That the changes in the county seem to be driven by these areas around the bay. West Traverse, Harbor Springs, Little Traverse. I did not do the numbers for Bear Creek or Resort or the city of Petoskey. My guess is city of Petoskey would show a lot of this because it's mostly Democratic wards in Petoskey. I'd be interested to look at Resort and Bear Creek. I haven't picked them out yet, but those would be fascinating to look at. So even locally, we see some of this and these interesting trends over the last 10, 12 years. And it'll be fascinating to see whether this is purely a Trump effect, right? Especially in the presidential races, but I don't think it is because 2022, he wasn't on the ballot, Whitmer was on the ballot, and you saw consistent, changes in that direction. So it'll be fascinating to keep watching this. Hopefully the college employs me long enough that I can keep doing this. So what do we take from this election? All right, so Americans are, there's a fair amount of calcification in our voting habits, right? There's fewer swing voters, there's fewer independent voters. And so what you get is small changes, not these huge waves, but these little ripples. So you don't get 25 or 30 seats in the House going to the Republicans, you get 9. This might be the future. Fewer waves and more kind of little ripples, right? In the states, what we see is more homogeneity, right? So a trifecta is where one party controls the state House, the state Senate, and the governor's chair. So what you see is out of 50 states, right, 38 of them have trifectas in one way or the other. Michigan being one of them now, having a Democratic trifecta, right? Whitmer in the governor, a Democrat, and Democrats can control the state House and the state Senate. Illinois is a Democratic trifecta. Tennessee's a Republican trifecta. There's lots of these states where you have less and less internal differences within a state. Only 12 states have split control out of 50. So you see more and more calcification, right? You get very little split ticket voting. So every state which voted for Trump in 2020 elected Republican senators in 2022, right? Republican candidates for Senate. The states that voted for Biden elected Democratic senators, right? Only 4 states out of 50 have a split Senate delegation. Every state sends 2 senators to Washington. Only 4 states have a Republican and a Democrat. if you take out the independents. And some of those might not be for long. West Virginia, all four of these states, the Democrat is up for re-election in 2024. And boy, I'd bet money against the Democrat winning there and maybe there. These two, maybe it's a little closer. But you might get down to only 2 states having split Senate delegations after 2024. And in fact, only 3 states elected governors who were from a party other than what the state voted for in 2020. So Georgia voted for Biden, they re-elected the Republican governor. Kansas voted for Trump, they re-elected the Democratic governor, and Nevada elected a Republican governor, even though they voted for Biden in 2020 in that election. So you get more and more kind of rigidity and calcification, right? That means it's harder and harder for any one party to break through and claim a big majority or claim a kind of wave election. Like, it's probably just not likely to happen given our kind of rigid political preferences, right? I think we're in the era of high turnout. Like, I don't know, 2022 kind of solidified it for me. Like, I don't think 2018 was an aberration. I think we're headed for high turnout, which is both a good and bad thing, right? As a political science professor, I say civic engagement, go vote, fabulous. More people are voting than are not voting. That's fantastic. On the other hand, people get really invested, right? And essentially what we're doing is we're rooting for laundry, reds or blues, and it's becoming more and more akin to, do you support Michigan State or the University of Michigan, right? We're like, does anybody know who plays for those teams anymore? We just know the colors they wear, right? And that's worrying to me because people do insane things for their sports teams, right? They like it. Sports fandom is irrational, right? Your team wins the championship. It's not like they're sending you money, right? They're selling you shirts. You're giving them money for winning a title. Because when the Cubs won the World Series in 2016, I nearly went broke. And I was like, I'm going to buy 10 shirts, because I need to have these for the rest of my life, because this happens every 100 years. So like, I've invested a lot in the Cubs. Them winning the title didn't get me anything. They took more money from me. So when we invest in our political parties like we do sports teams, people do irrational things. And that's not quite great from my point of view. But, maybe this can be modulated in some way. But we're in the era of high turnout. I don't think this is going away anytime soon. But one, and so discrete factors in individual states still play a role. It's not all red or blue or laundry. Candidate quality really matters, right? Democrats had some crappy candidates. Republicans had some crappy candidates. People won or lost in part, not so much because voters love them, but because they didn't love the other candidate. And so that still plays a role. It plays more of a role in Senate and statewide candidacies than in House of Representatives races, which tend to be small and local and less, kind of more immune to that. But you still need good candidates, right? You still need to run good campaigns. It's not like you can just say, I'm a Democrat, vote for me. I'm a Republican, vote for me. Like, it doesn't quite work that way. You have to put in the time and do the tackling and blocking. But it's getting less and less important. Let's put it that way. But one other thing that 2022 really showed is this notion of persuasion versus base rallying, right? So these are 2 schools of thought about how you run campaigns. One is, if I'm a Republican, all I have to do is make sure the Republicans turn out, right? So I'm going to go and just make sure that I get 95% of Republicans to turn out and vote for me. And like, if I don't never talk to an undecided voter or a Democrat, I'm going to be okay, right? This is a view of politics that essentially says, 40% of the country is in each camp. There's 20% in the middle. I don't need to worry about that 20% as long as I can get everybody on my 40% to turn out, right? I just need to turn out my base and I'm going to be okay. The other school of thought is persuasion, right? I need to go out and talk to people, even if they disagree with me, even if they're undecided, right? Because every person that I can flip from red to blue or blue to red is 2 votes lost for my opponent, right? I'm gaining a vote and taking one away from them. So there's a logic to investing in trying to persuade people of the other party or persuade undecided voters, because that's actually more of a benefit to you. What we saw in a number of the close House races, and this is especially true downstate in, I forget, it's like the 7th district in Michigan, Alyssa Slotkin, who represents basically Livingston County west to part of Ingham County, that slot of Michigan. and it's a Republican district. Trump carried it in 2020. It was the most expensive House race in the country in 2022. The most money spent on ads and travel and media and all the rest of it. She managed to win it by 6 points. And what she credited it to was that volunteers went to every door, right, and wanted to go talk to everybody. It is very easy not to go to every door. A student of mine ran a state Senate election a couple of years ago on the Huron Shore, and he showed me the app on his phone where he's like, well, I can design a little block door knocking thing, and I just hit this button and all the pegs fall on all Republican voters. So I know to go to your house and your house, but skip over you, and go to your house and your house and skip over you. He's like, it's real easy. That way you never have to talk to a mad voter. I'm like, wow, well, that's amazing. Like, but the mad voters are the ones you need to do to win the election, right? So there's a real debate among campaign professionals about what's the best strategy here. Do you just throw red meat to the base and try to make sure they turn out and drive up the negatives on your opponent so that your opponent's supporters go, oh gosh, I can't vote for that person, maybe I'll just stay home? Or do you work to go out and try to persuade, right? And Slotkin's race in Michigan, this was kind of a test case, right? Because people were like, it's really expensive, everybody's well financed, it's a Republican district. If she can pull it out, maybe that's evidence that this persuasion approach works. And she managed to win by 5 or 6 points, right? Yes. Right. Yeah, which is a more Democratic area, right? Yeah. And to be fair, the Independent Redistricting Commission drew those lines, right? So yeah, right, exactly. But she still managed to, it was a Republican, yeah, it was a Republican +4 district. She managed to win by 4 or 5. So it was a 9-point swing in her direction, which she said was all due to this strategy. Now others said, well, you're well known, you're the incumbent, your opponent is, is not in a similar position. You can do not fake, you can provide services to your constituency, all the rest of it. But look, 9-point swing is a 9-point swing, right? Let's not get too confused here. Yeah. So we can take a lot of things from this. All right. So go ahead, Mary. So what about 2024? All right. So the research is very clear. The best prediction of election results is the economy. You can boil it all down to that, right? Especially the economy in election year. Okay. So here on the y-axis is the vote that the incumbent receives. So if you are this is in a re-election race. So as the sitting president, you want to somehow be above this line, right? Above 50%. This is the change in GDP, gross domestic product, during the election year from the fourth quarter. So this would be like the fourth quarter of 2023. So December 2023 to the second quarter of 2024. How do people feel about the economy? You want it to be up here, right? Growing, not down here, shrinking. What you can see here is that as you go up here, you get a lot of incumbent re-elections. Here's Eisenhower, here's LBJ, Nixon, Reagan, Clinton, George H.W. Bush, not a re-election, but again, another Republican administration, George W. Bush, right? And the more you come down here, you see incumbent parties losing, right? 2008, right? Jimmy Carter. Here is John Kennedy beating Richard Nixon, right? So what you want is the economy to be growing, right? So if you're Biden, you want 2024 to be up here and not so much down here, right? As it seems like it's a fairly clear, straight path that the better the economy is doing, the higher your vote share is, thus the more likely you are to be reelected, right? But think about 2 elections. So one is Reagan, Morning in America, right? 1984. And one is 1980, let's bring the hostages home, right? Carter's reelection bid. This is always said, boy, one of the greatest campaigns ever. Boy, Reagan, he won 49 states against Mondale. Mondale won Minnesota and Washington, D.C. I mean, it was over in a heartbeat, right? And here's Reagan beating Carter in 1980. Okay, let's think about those 2 elections. Here's Carter's job approval rating. Not great. Not great, doesn't get reelected. So will Biden be like Carter? Or will Biden be like Reagan? Timing is everything. If that election is held in 1982 and not 1984, Ronald Reagan doesn't get a second term. Right? Now, again, what happens after 82, right, is the economy starts to pick up for Ronald Reagan. Right, by 1984, it's humming along, morning in America, things are great, re-elect me, historic triumph. 1980, Carter, failed president. Biden, Reagan, and Carter, they're all in the same spot in year 2. I don't know what'll happen, but it could go either direction, right? The best case scenario for Biden is that inflation comes down, the economy picks up, he cruises to a second term. The worst case is the economy continues to be poor, inflation really takes a toll, economic growth really slows, and unemployment returns, he becomes Carter. Could be Carter, could be Reagan. I don't know. It depends, right? I don't know, my guess, and maybe I'm a bit aggressive here, but my guess is it comes down to 4 states in 2024. Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, and Georgia. I could be accused of being a bit aggressive here and a bit aggressive here. The reality is that Democrats have won each of these states like 7 of the last 8 elections. Is 2016 an aberration or a pattern? I don't know. Trump won both of these. Biden won both of these. We just reelected Whitmer. Democrats just won in Pennsylvania. I don't know. Maybe I toss him in the Democratic candidate column a bit too early. But my guess is a tiny sliver of Americans decide this race. Undecided voters in these 4 states. Right now, I mean, just going by the map right now, you need 270 electoral votes to win. That's these little arrows right here. At this moment, I'd probably put 260 in the Democratic column and 235 in the Republicans. If I'm the Democrats, I need to win 1 of that, or that, and I'm in. If you're the Republicans, you got to win 35 votes. Some combination of these 3, or some combination of these 3, or these 3. I think if I had to bet, I put it in this map and I'd say, I don't know about those 4. But that's why I would give a slight edge to the Democrats in the sense that there's more paths to victory. Maybe, but maybe not. I don't know. Is he Carter or is he Reagan? Like, I don't know, right? I'm not sure. Again, this map is appropriate to the 2022 race, which will be based on electoral college reshuffling after the 2022 census. So Republicans benefited because Texas and Florida increased their vote total, whereas some of the states here in the industrial Midwest lost some of their vote total. So this edges towards the Republicans a bit because they can capitalize on some of this, but also Colorado gained and Arizona gained. Yes, I don't know. That's an advantage to the Republicans, but to me, there's more paths for the Democrats here to 270 than there are Republicans, right? And the other thing, of course, is who the Republicans nominate. There's a bunch of people who are going to be running. You know, if Trump gets the nomination, most polls seem to say that Americans aren't prepared to support him for a second term. If Trump doesn't get the nomination, it might be worse for Republicans because since when has Trump ever been able to say, well, somebody else won, so I'll sit on the sidelines? Does he run as a third party? Does he heckle the Republican opponent? Does he damage Republican voter prospects? I don't know. Like, who knows what will happen there? But I mean, my guess is a very slim percentage of Americans will actually decide this race, you know, in 24. So I don't know what time it is because I don't see a clock, but thank you for your kind attention. As always, I'm happy to listen to questions that veer off into comments and points, and I'll just sit here quietly as you make your points. But I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. But thank you very much. Awesome. We can all go home. No. But yes, sir. Oh, yeah, I mean, one thing that we had, so the question was on immigration as a policy issue. Okay, immigration is a policy issue and how that's going to affect things. I think it's maybe very interesting. One of the things we saw in 2020 was shifts in Hispanic voting patterns, especially in South Texas, the Rio Grande Valley and South Florida, and more so in this case in the South Texas question, right? So it was always assumed among Democratic leaders that a very pro-immigration message would would resound with Hispanic voters in the South and the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. And what we saw was a shift in support, especially in the Rio Grande Valley and South Texas, among Hispanic voters that moved very much in the Republican direction. And there was all kinds of ink spilled online about what this meant. Was this Hispanic voters in the Southwest upset about immigration, either restrictions or immigration policies that were viewed as too lenient? Was this about social issues that Hispanic Americans move more in the Republican camp than the Democratic camp? Was this about economic issues? And as a result, this has been, we need more elections to, figure out what's going on. But that has been a huge issue in the South, not only for Hispanic voters, but all voters, is around policies around immigration. What was really interesting was that broad shift, especially in the Rio Grande Valley, where many Democrats thought they might have a chance to win certain races in Texas, and that just spiked it entirely. And that was really a huge shock, I think, to many Democratic leaders, was about how these messages on immigration play and with what voters. And so that'll be something that bears watching as we go forward to see if that's the norm or an aberration. We don't really know. Yes, sir.
You mentioned how important the economy is to presidential election.
Right.
It just popped into my mind that, of course, if our economy goes south,
and
it's because the Republicans have not released the hostage, and they get blamed. I can change that whole paradigm.
True. I mean, those that assumes facts and evidence, that aren't there yet. The politics of who gets blamed for bad economies, in general, presidents always wear this, fairly or unfairly, right? Whether they deserve it or whether they don't. And you can look at that graph and you can look at presidents who lost re-election or parties who lost the White House, and you can say, oh, it was because of this, or, it was because of the oil shocks or whatever. And like, who could have done anything about that? And you're like, that doesn't matter, right? Voters hire the president for a job, whether they can do it or whether they can't. They expect them to be superheroes. They're not. Right. But like it or not, that's what they expect. So no matter what the blame game is around the economy or inflation or China or debt limits, Biden's going to wear it in the minds of voters. And that's fairly or unfairly. That's how it always goes. Yes. Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, again, right, I talk about the economy in a national sense, and then I bring up that map and I say, well, it only matters in 4 places. So I realize that. The economy can either bring in voters who previously hadn't voted if they're frustrated about things. It can also move. I mean, again, it doesn't take much to move some of these states, right? What was the stat in 2020? A shift of 44,000 voters in 3 states changes the election from Biden to Trump. So like, we look at 180 million votes cast, and it all comes down to like, tens of thousands of voters in specific places. So if the economy is going south, or unemployment's going up, or interest rates are still high, or whatever, it can shift that kind of small section of voters one way or the other. And then all of a sudden it looks like a landslide in one direction, right? So some of those big numbers are deceiving, where you look at like electoral college votes. I mean, Biden wins 306 out of 538 electoral college votes. And we say, wow, what a huge majority. 44,000 vote changes in 3 states makes it go the other way. So it matters in those narrow ways as well, right? Scott. Oh, yeah. Yep. Oh, yeah. Yeah. That's why on that chart, it was changes in GDP from Q4 to Q2, whereas the election's in the 3rd or 4th quarter of the year. So it's about built-in perception, right? As in the months leading up to the election, not how it's doing on election day, right? So the classic case there is George H.W. Bush, right? George H.W. Bush leads, the coalition to defeat Saddam Hussein in the Gulf War in 1991. Everybody loves George H.W. Bush. A recession hits shortly thereafter. Everybody sours on him. And in the months leading up to the election in 1992, the economy is actually picking up steam. Like it's growing at, 2.5%, 3% a quarter. And Bush is saying, the economy, it's great, it's great, it's great. Give me credit. And it was like, nope, remember when it was terrible? We're voting you out of office, right? Like that's the classic perception versus reality. How voters make up their minds, if I knew this, I'd be very, very wealthy. But we tend to look at things in the months preceding the election because people get an idea of how the economy is going and or it is affecting them. And then they tend to project that onto the candidates, blame someone or reward someone, and then you move on, right? So it's not always about how it's doing that day. It's more about 6 months before, because those perceptions tend to get frozen. Plus, candidates have a good incentive to keep ringing that bell if it's beneficial to them. So if the economy is bad in January, February, March, April of that election year, the out party is going to say, it's the president. We blame him. He's got to get out of here, right? What was that old line? A recession is when your neighbor loses your job. A depression is when you lose your job. Recovery is when the president loses his job, right? That was Reagan's line about Carter, right? So that tends to get solidified in the minds of voters, right? Plus, improving economies, improving GDP is often improving an individual's lives is often a lag based on when the economy improves, right? The stock market can go up and nobody sees the benefit of that for like 3, 4, 5 months when job production goes up or spending goes up or something like that. So it's often kind of that spring. If you can know by the time the spring, you can kind of predict these things. So. Well, it depends on what motivates voters, right? I wish I knew, the economy is almost always listed as the #1 issue, right? Occasionally it can be overtaken. So like 2002, this was like the security and safety election, right? After 9/11, people voted for security and safety. The economy came down off the list. 2022, there's a lot of argument around, especially in Michigan, politics of abortion as driving voter turnout in one direction or another. But even then, when you look at the list of things, economy is like the second, third, or often the first issue, right? How people make decisions, I wish I had a better insight to that, but we have to go off of what they tell us and that they care about it, right? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. No, hopefully. Yeah.
And what about the change in the media?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. 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 That's like a cause of that calcification, right? That like I talked about. What causes that kind of calcification to rigidity? There's a lot of factors involved there. One of them is undoubtedly the ability to choose the media ecosystem that you want to live in, right? And so as opposed to getting a newspaper delivered every day and you have every section and you kind of read it, whether you like these stories or not, now you look at it on your phone or you curate through social media and you say, I'm going to follow this person and that person, but not them and not them. It's the equivalent of essentially getting the newspaper, throwing out 3 sections that you don't like and only reading the 2 that you do, which, when I was a kid, that's exactly what I did. I was like sports section and news. And I was like, who needs the arts, so that is undoubtedly a factor that plays into that calcification, right? That the ability to see and respond to commentary and news stories that trigger, releases of dopamine in your brain. That if you have certain beliefs and you read a lot of sources that say, these are all the right beliefs, you say, oh man, I am really smart. It's like, look at all these people, they all agree with me, right? Whereas reading a bunch of people who disagree with you produces all kinds of brain chemicals that make us, tense and shrug our shoulders. And we say, man, I really hate this feeling. And the internet and social media allow you to say, you know what you can do? You can like block these people. And you're like, hey, all right, done, right? And it's fabulous. It's also really bad for you, but right. Yeah, that's true, right? On the other hand, we have a way of tending to show how the polls are wrong, right? So, I mean, the argument around the polling is kind of like you consume a whole bunch of polling, and if your candidate isn't winning, you just decide not to go vote, right? On the other hand, polls are not the greatest at these kinds of things. There's huge margins of error. There's a lot of difficulty in getting responses these days. So we have seen the polling industry really shaken by this and kind of like, oh boy, what do we know what we're even measuring anymore? And it's really, really difficult. What I really like is looking at those really intensely local races, because, you know, as good as the news review is, I'm not seeing a lot of like Neil DeMoose, John DeMoose versus Barb Conley polling data. You know, I can't really pour through as much as I would love to pour through it. I can't until somebody writes a huge check and I start my own polling firm. But you know, so it affects some races and not others, right? But what we see in those townships is is consistent movement in the same direction, right? Whether these races are polled and you're reading about like Whitmer's beating Dixon or Biden's beating Trump or whatever, versus the Neil Frisky race or this county commission race, right? Like you're not going to see that. People go vote for it anyway, and you see consistent movement in the same directions. Like that seems to belie something about voters' intentions. So. All right. Thank you. Right. Yep. I appreciate it.